Okay, good day, grade 11s. So it seems something went wrong when I was trying to record the Zoom lesson today. So for those of you that watch this at a later stage, this is just basically a recap. So I'm going to go through it very quickly and I'm going to try and not repeat myself too often and try and make the video a bit shorter. So in that spirit, let's jump in. Okay, so at the start of respiration, we basically just recap everything that you should know by now. So what we did in grade 8 and the discussions that we had on respiration when we discussed other topics like nutrition or maybe even certain topics in grade 10. Respiration is something that comes up quite often. So hopefully some of this information is familiar to you. So usually I would start by asking, how would you define respiration, or what do you know about respiration? And hopefully you get to something similar to this first sentence. Usually learners are able to get to this first part, or to this part about energy, and they know that it's a process whereby cells make energy. But if we were to define it a bit more broadly, then we would say that respiration is the process that takes place in all cells to make energy for life processes. So anything that you do needs energy, and that energy will be provided by respiration. Okay, so then some of the other things that they might remember about respiration is that we need glucose and oxygen. Okay, so glucose and oxygen is needed for respiration. And you might also remember that water and carbon dioxide is produced during respiration. So this is what is needed and this is what is produced. Okay, but actually the main thing that is produced during respiration is energy. That is the whole purpose of respiration, is to produce energy. And the way that or the molecule that contains this energy eventually is called ATP. So ATP is something new, something that you're not too familiar with. We briefly discussed it in photosynthesis. But I will just quickly recap it on the next slide. But ATP is basically like a very energy-rich molecule. So it stores energy which can then be used later. So ATP is what is produced, the main thing that is produced during respiration. And then water and carbon dioxide is produced as byproducts. Something else that is important to note is that enzymes are important for respiration just like it is for any other metabolic reaction that happens inside of cells. So enzymes speed up the reaction of respiration, just like it does with any other reaction, but that's just important to note for respirations. Enzymes speed up the reaction. And then lastly, learners would also usually remember that respiration takes place in the mitochondria of cells. Okay, but we'll discuss this a bit more later. Okay, so ATP, we looked at this when we did photosynthesis. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. Triphosphate meaning it has 3 phosphates bound to it. You don't need to know that long name, but what I'm trying to show you is the 3 phosphates here and how that is important. So you can see here's the 3 phosphates. This is ATP. Sorry for my bad handwriting. And then this reacts and breaks down into ADP, okay, adenosine diphosphate, meaning it only has 2 phosphates. And so what this means is that this molecule is broken up. This bond over here is broken, and it then is split into ADP and an extra phosphate. Okay, that might not seem important, but what happens when this takes place is when you break that bond, it's like when you snap a stick, then it releases energy. So this sound that you hear when you snap a stick is sound waves coming off of it from the energy that is released. So in a similar way, not really quite that similar, but the idea is similar. When you break the ATP molecule, you release energy. And this energy is then what will be used for whatever needs energy inside of the body. So whether it is when you go for a run, or when your brain is using energy right now to interpret my voice, or when you are thinking, or when you're digestive system is working in the background. Everything needs energy, and it will get energy through this process, through ATP breaking down into ADP and releasing energy. Okay, so how can we summarize all of this in a nice equation? Well, we just put everything that goes in on the one side and everything that comes out on the other side, and we then make it into an equation. So the equation here is glucose plus oxygen forms energy, carbon dioxide, and water. Okay, so these are the requirements on this side and the products on this side. And yeah, so we just write it like a normal math equation, but then you would see here above the arrow we have enzymes. So the reason we put enzymes here above the arrow is because enzymes are still needed for respiration, as we said earlier, but it doesn't form part of the reaction. It's just like a mold where the reaction takes place. So it doesn't go in and gets changed by the reaction like oxygen and glucose does, but it is needed for the reaction to take place. So we put it here above the arrow. And then this is the word equation, and we can also write this as a chemical equation. So this is when we just write all of these compounds as chemical formulas. So you should be familiar with most of them, but the one that you might not know here is glucose. So glucose is C6H12O6. So you must just remember that. So glucose plus oxygen is O2 plus energy, which is ATP, remember, and carbon dioxide, which is CO2, and water, which is H2O. Okay, so just make sure that you know this chemical equation as well. Okay, then just a different way of representing all of that is to put it into a table. So this is also a common question, to tabulate the reactants and products of respiration. And a lot of times people or learners don't know what tabulate means, because then they do it completely or incorrectly. So when it says tabulate, you must draw a table. So you put the requirements on one side and the products on the other side. So in this case, you would have glucose, oxygen, and then even though I said enzymes is not a reactant, it is a requirement. So it is something that is required. So we also, since this table only has 2 columns, we also put it here with the others. Okay, but it's not quite the same as glucose and oxygen, but we still put it on this side. And then what is produced, what is the products? That would be the energy in the form of ATP, carbon dioxide, and the water. Okay, so just a different way of summarizing this information. Okay, then something else that you should be familiar with from grade 10 is the structure of the mitochondrion, okay, or mitochondria for plural. So yeah, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Mitochondria, or the powerhouse of the cell, it's where respiration takes place. So that's why we draw this drawing over here. And it consists of a double membrane. So it means an outer and an inner membrane. And the inner membrane is folded. Okay, and whenever there's folds in biology, then it means that it's likely that the organism or the cell or the organelle or whatever is trying to increase the surface area for some reason, and that is the case with the mitochondria. So these folds, which are called cristae, increase the surface area for where the reactions for respiration can take place. Okay, so that's the membranes, the cristae, and then the matrix are just the fluid inside of the organelle we refer to as the matrix. Okay, so then kind of connected to the mitochondria, or the structure of the mitochondria, is the adaptation. So how are the mitochondria adapted to be specialized for their function? So 2 ways. As discussed, the inner membrane is folded, and this increases the surface area for where the chemical reactions can take place. But then the second one is that the membrane is permeable. Okay, so if you remember from grade 10, permeability refers to how easily things can move through a membrane. Okay, so usually in and out of a cell or an organelle. okay, because it would have a membrane around the outside. Then permeability would refer to how easily things can move in and out. So in this case, we say that the membrane is permeable, so it means things can easily move in and out. And that is because the ingredients or the chemicals needed for respiration needs to easily move in and out. Otherwise, it would slow down the process. Okay, so the mitochondria has a permeable membrane which allows substances to enter. Okay, then finally we get to the new work, the grade 11 work, or at least where we focus on for grade 11. So this you should be, or you wouldn't have done before, and that is the fact that respiration is actually divided into two separate processes. So up to now, we've always referred to respiration as this global term, and we just refer to it as respiration. But in actual fact, there's different kinds of respiration. So we get aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. Now we will discuss this more in detail in the following slides, but basically what it refers to is during aerobic respiration, we need oxygen, and anaerobic respiration, we do not require oxygen. Okay, so that's the main difference there. Okay, but there's also other important differences, so we'll look at them now. Okay, so we start with aerobic respiration. So as I said, aerobic respiration needs or requires oxygen. So it cannot take place if there's no oxygen. Okay, and then also aerobic respiration takes place mainly in the mitochondria. Okay, so this is the kind of respiration that you're used to, okay, because up to now we've always said that it requires oxygen and it takes place in the mitochondria. Okay, so this is nothing new to you at this point. Okay, but it is important to note because it is different from anaerobic respiration. So it requires oxygen and it takes place in the mitochondria. Then another important thing to note about aerobic respiration is that it is by far the most effective of the two respirations. Okay, it's far more effective than anaerobic respiration. So just to give you some sort of idea, during aerobic respiration, one glucose molecule produces 38 ATP molecules. Okay, so one glucose produces 38 ATP, whereas anaerobic respiration only produces 2 ATP molecules. Okay, so it is way less effective, or anaerobic respiration is way less effective. Okay, so aerobic respiration is about 19 times more effective. Okay, so we said that it requires oxygen, takes place in the mitochondria, is way more effective. But what are some examples of aerobic respiration? So the main one that I usually use in class is, firstly, as you are sitting there now, you are almost definitely making use of aerobic respiration for your brain function, for your muscles to keep your posture, for your digestive system. All of that would be making use of aerobic respiration to make energy for you. Because there isn't a lot of strain on your body, so it doesn't need to make a lot of energy, so then it would use aerobic respiration. Another example would be when you go for a long, slow jog or long distance running, that would also be aerobic respiration. And the reason for this, and we'll discuss this a bit more when we do anaerobic respiration, but the reason for this is because, as discussed, aerobic respiration is way more effective. So when possible, your body wants to make energy through aerobic respiration. But when it is not possible is scenarios where you have to make a lot of energy quickly. So even though anaerobic respiration is less effective, it is able to produce energy a lot more at a lot faster rate. So when you say have to do a 100-meter sprint, then your body would use anaerobic respiration to make energy more quickly. But the downside of anaerobic respiration is it produces a lot of waste product, which we're going to discuss eventually when we do anaerobic respiration. So for now, just know that aerobic respiration is more effective, and it's what your body uses most of the time. So aerobic respiration is further divided into 3 stages. Okay, glycolysis, Krebs cycle, or the Krebs cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation. Okay, and we're going to discuss each of these now a bit more in depth. Okay, so the first phase of aerobic respiration is called glycolysis, and this very first sentence might be a bit confusing now, because here we say that glycolysis does not require oxygen, and it takes place in the cytoplasm. Okay, which is contrary to what we just said, that aerobic respiration requires oxygen and takes place in the mitochondria. Now we are contradicting ourselves. Okay, but this is because this is only the first step of aerobic respiration. The other steps will take place in the mitochondria and will require oxygen. Okay, so this might seem contradictory here as the first sentence, but we correct ourselves later on in the process. Okay, so glycolysis does not require oxygen, so this phase does not require oxygen, and it takes place in the cytoplasm, not the mitochondria. Okay, so what happens during glycolysis? So we start with the one glucose molecule. Okay, so everything always starts with one glucose molecule, and that glucose molecule is turned into two pyruvic acids, or pyruvate. Now, you don't really need to know much about pyruvic acid. You can look here at this diagram here at the bottom. Here's a glucose molecule, which consists of 6 carbon atoms bound together. And basically what happens is we just split the carbon atoms into 3 carbon atoms called pyruvic acid. Okay, but you don't need to know much about the chemistry behind it. So just know glucose changes into 2 pyruvic acids. And then during this process, it's going to release 2 ATP molecules. Okay, remember ATP is the energy molecule that is the whole purpose of respiration. So this process produces 2 ATPs. But remember, we said that the whole process actually produces 38 ATPs, so there's a lot more ATPs to come. Okay, so we have the glucose turns into 2 pyruvic acids and 2 ATPs. Then something else that is produced is 2 energy-rich hydrogen atoms. So this is another complicated concept, but we actually make it very simple in grade 11. We don't go a lot in depth in it. So just know that during glycolysis, it produces 2 energy-rich hydrogen atoms, and we annotate it as just H+, and these H pluses, or energy-rich hydrogen atoms, are very important for the last phase, for oxidative phosphorylation. Okay, so just know that we're going to produce a bunch of these because they are going to be needed for the last phase of aerobic respiration. Okay, so if we were to summarize all of glycolysis, then we can do it in this formula. Okay, so we say 1 glucose turns into 2 pyruvic acids, 2 ATPs, and 2 energy-rich hydrogen atoms. Okay, so now these products are going to move on to the next 2 phases. Okay, so pyruvic acid is going to be needed for the Krebs cycle, and the hydrogen atoms are going to be needed for the oxidative phosphorylation. So let's see how those processes look like. Okay, so the Krebs cycle is a very complicated, long process with a lot of steps, but luckily you don't need to know all of these steps. This is, if you go on to university, then you will do this, but for grade 11, we just summarize it and look at the end products that come out from it. Okay, so important to note, however, about the Krebs cycle is that this takes place in the mitochondria. So unlike glycolysis, which took place in cytoplasm, the Krebs cycle takes place in the mitochondria. And it only happens if oxygen is present. Okay, so it doesn't actually use oxygen, but it can only happen if there is oxygen. Okay, but I'll elaborate about this a bit more in the next phase. Okay, so then at the start of the process, pyruvic acid that is produced during glycolysis enters the mitochondria, and the pyruvic acid will then be used as or for the reactions of the Krebs cycle. So the pyruvic acid goes through a series of reactions that results in many more energy-rich hydrogen atoms being produced. Okay, so the exact number is a bit complicated, so we just say, or all you have to know is that it produces a lot of these hydrogen atoms. Okay, so we produced 2 during the previous phase, and now we produce a bunch more of them. Okay, and again, they are going to be important for the next phase. And then also during this process, carbon dioxide is produced as a waste product. Okay, so this is our first waste product that is being produced, carbon dioxide. Okay, so remember, carbon dioxide is produced during the Krebs cycle. And then these hydrogen atoms can go on to the next stage where they are going to be used to make ATP. So let's look at that. Okay, so the last phase is oxidative phosphorylation. And this is where we are going to produce all of the remaining ATP molecules. Okay, but first, this also takes place in the mitochondria. And very important, this requires oxygen. Okay, so oxygen is actually a reactant in the process, or some of the processes of oxidative phosphorylation, or some of the chemical reactions of oxidative phosphorylation. Okay, so very important, it takes place in the mitochondria and it requires oxygen. Okay, so what happens during this phase? So again, this is a long, complicated, drawn-out process with a lot of reactions, but in summary, what happens is all of these hydrogen atoms that were produced in the previous phases are now being used and passed to various acceptors, which releases ATP molecules. Okay, so basically, the hydrogen atoms are used to make ATP molecules. Okay, that's what's important. That's what you need to understand. So all of these hydrogen atoms are used to make ATP molecules. And in total, this process will produce 36 ATP. Okay, so there's a bunch of these reactions, ATP, a bunch of these reactions, and all of them will produce ATP. In total, 36 ATP. But also, as part of these reactions, you will always produce some waste product, and in this case, water is produced as a waste product. So a way that I remember which waste product is with which phase is, so water is H2O, and this oxidative phosphorylation, okay, oxidative, so it needs oxygen, and that oxygen combined with the hydrogen will likely at some point produce water. Okay, so you don't need to understand how that happens, but just know that, oh, there's the H's and the O's, and together it's going to make H2O, so water is produced during this process. So, yeah, just remember, water is produced as a waste product during oxidative phosphorylation. Okay, and that is all for oxidative phosphorylation. So it takes place in the mitochondria, requires oxygen, and it is where the hydrogen atoms is turned into ATP and some water as a waste product. And then if we were to summarize all of the aerobic respiration, so all 3 phases, then we would see that 1 glucose molecule turned into 38 ATP molecules. Okay, and as mentioned earlier, okay, this is important to contrast it with anaerobic respiration, which we'll do next. Okay, so just remember, 1 glucose turns into 38 ATP. Okay, so this diagram over here is a very, very nice summary of all 3 phases. Okay, and usually it seems quite intimidating, but in class I usually make the learners give me the answers, and usually they can give it up without much hassle, because it is actually quite self-explanatory. So important here to note is that obviously this over here is the mitochondria. Okay, so this is going to indicate some of the processes that takes place in the mitochondria, and then the outside here is the cytoplasm. Okay, so everything that happens outside of the mitochondria happens in the cytoplasm. Okay, so just imagine this is a very big cell, and then this is the cytoplasm outside of it, and this is the mitochondria, one of the mitochondria in the cells. Okay, so let's go through the whole process. So as I mentioned, we start with 1 glucose molecule. Okay, and that glucose molecule will then be used in the first phase of aerobic respiration, which is glycolysis. Okay, so glycolysis is where we take glucose and it is broken down into pyruvate or pyruvic acid and 2 ATP and 2 hydrogen atoms. Okay, so if you go back and you look at glycolysis, then you would see it's basically exactly this. 1 glucose turns into 2 pyruvic acids, 2 ATPs, and 2 hydrogen atoms. Then the pyruvic acid or the pyruvate moves into the mitochondria and goes to the second phase of aerobic respiration, which is the Krebs cycle. So during the Krebs cycle, the pyruvate or the pyruvic acid, pyruvate is just a synonym for pyruvic acid. You can use either one, that's fine. So pyruvic acid enters the Krebs cycle and it produces a bunch more of these hydrogen atoms, and it also produces CO2 as a byproduct or as a waste product. Okay, then all of these hydrogen atoms are going to go to the third phase of aerobic respiration, which is oxidative phosphorylation. And during oxidative phosphorylation, we produce 36 ATP molecules. But in order to do that, we need oxygen. Okay, oxidative phosphorylation needs oxygen, and it is going to produce water as a byproduct. Okay, so I hope this diagram helps you to understand it all and summarize it all. I find it very helpful, so take some time to understand this diagram. Don't try and remember it, or don't try to learn it like a parrot. You should be able to do this based on your knowledge. Okay, so don't just rewrite this diagram the whole time trying to remember it. You should be able to go through the process, the theory of the processes, and then you should be able to draw this diagram or fill in this diagram using that knowledge. Okay, so that's the purpose of this diagram. Okay, so then we're going to move on to anaerobic respiration. So anaerobic respiration, as mentioned right at the start, happens in the absence of oxygen. Okay, so when there's no oxygen, so it does not require oxygen. And also it takes place in the cytoplasm. Okay, so it doesn't need a mitochondria. But the drawback is that it only produces 2 ATP molecules compared to the 38 of aerobic respiration. Okay, so only 2 ATP molecules. As mentioned, the anaerobic respiration is obviously way less effective, but it is able to produce a lot more energy at a lot faster rate. So when your body needs energy very quickly, then it would make use of anaerobic respiration to make that energy. So examples of where this would be is when you are doing rigorous exercise. So if you go for a sprint or you lifting very heavy weights, then you would then your body would be making use of the anaerobic system. Okay, other examples where you see anaerobic respiration is in certain plants and in certain microorganisms like yeast. Okay, so we're going to discuss this a bit more right at the end. Okay, so as mentioned in the previous slide, anaerobic respiration takes place in animals, plants, and microorganisms. So we're going to look at how they differ between the different organisms. Okay, so there's 2 types of anaerobic respiration. One type that happens in animals and one type that happens in plants and microorganisms. So let's first look at how it happens in or takes place in animals. So the first step of anaerobic respiration is the exact same as the first step of aerobic respiration. Okay, so you have 1 glucose molecule which is broken down into 2 pyruvic acid molecules through the process of glycolysis. So the first step is exactly the same as for aerobic respiration. Okay, so nothing too strange at this point. But the difference then comes in what happens with this pyruvic acid. So when there is no oxygen, then the pyruvic acid cannot go into the mitochondria and be used for the Krebs cycle and the oxidative phosphorylation. So then it needs to, your body needs to do something else with the pyruvic acid. So then your body turns the pyruvic acid into lactic acid. Okay, and we call the process lactic acid fermentation. Okay, so the second phase or second process of anaerobic respiration is lactic acid fermentation. Okay, so again, not too complicated. All you need to know is pyruvic acid is turned into lactic acid. Okay, but then something quite interesting about lactic acid is that the lactic acid can be changed back into pyruvic acid when oxygen is present again. So I'm quickly going to explain this, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it. So the way that I usually remember this is when you are practicing sport on the sports field and you had quite an hectic session, then afterwards your coach should tell you that you should go for a jog, or to cool down, or to do some low intensity exercise as a cool down, essentially. And the reason you do this is because if you did a rigorous exercise and you did a lot of exercise at high intensity during the practice, then you would have made a lot of this lactic acid in the process. And lactic acid is actually what causes muscle soreness when you do exercise. So in order to try and prevent muscle soreness and stiffness, it is recommended that you do some low intensity exercise so that your body can turn the lactic acid back into pyruvic acid and then use it for normal aerobic respiration. So the reason why your body is able to do that is because when you do low intensity exercise, then it has access to oxygen, and it can then produce energy through aerobic respiration. So it can then take the lactic acid, it can basically reverse this process. Okay, and the reason that's good for you is because lactic acid is bad for you. It's not going to kill you, but it is still not, your body doesn't deal well with it. So when possible, your body wants to remove that lactic acid. So that's why it's good to cool down after you did some high intensity exercise. Okay, so that's just the way that I like to remember this last point over here. Okay, so how does that compare to anaerobic respiration in plants and animals? Well, it is again fairly similar. We again start with the first phase being exactly the same. Glucose is broken down into pyruvic acid through glycolysis. Okay, so exactly the same as anaerobic respiration in animals, and exactly the same as the first phase of aerobic respiration. Okay, but again, it is at the second point where things change a bit. So the pyruvic acid is converted, in the case of plants and yeast, the pyruvic acid is converted into ethanol, CO2, and yeast. Okay, and ethanol is an alcohol. So you might recognize this a bit, or this might seem somewhat familiar, because this is actually what people use to make alcohol. And we call that process alcoholic fermentation. Okay, so this is, if you knew someone who tried to make some alcohol during the lockdown, then they would have used the anaerobic respiration of yeast or some sort of culture to produce the alcohol. Okay, so what happens in this case is you have some sort of sugar or starch that gets broken down, and then there's some sort of microorganism in there like yeast, which is then going to break it down into ethanol, CO2, and heat. So the ethanol is what makes it an alcoholic beverage. The CO2 will create bubbles. So in something like beer, the CO2 comes from, or that bubbles comes from the CO2. In other alcohols, the CO2 just evaporates. But then also, if you were to go to where they do this and you feel the containers in which they make the alcohol, then you would feel that the containers are quite warm to the touch. And that is because it also produces heat. So it heats up during this process. Not a lot, but you can definitely feel the difference. Okay, so important to note, okay, is that anaerobic respiration in plants and animals is just like with, anaerobic respiration in plants and yeast is just like it is in animals, at least for the first step, except the end product is ethanol, CO2, and heat, and the process is called alcoholic fermentation. Okay, so hopefully that made some sense to you. This is a very nice summary of everything that we just discussed. Everything that is important, well, almost everything that is important, okay, is summarized in this diagram over here, or this table over here. Okay, so here we have the aerobic respiration, and here we have anaerobic respiration, and then it is further subdivided into the two types of anaerobic respiration, okay, for plants, for animals, and for plants, and also yeast. Okay, so I think you actually have to complete this table into your notes. So complete it in your notes and make sure you understand why all of this is mentioned here. Okay, so quickly go through it. So anaerobic respiration takes place in the mitochondria, whereas, sorry, I think I just said anaerobic. Aerobic respiration takes place in the mitochondria, whereas anaerobic respiration takes place in the cytoplasm. Okay, so a big difference there. The processes in aerobic respiration is glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation, whereas for anaerobic respiration, it is also glycolysis, the first step, but then lactic acid fermentation takes place in animals, and alcoholic fermentation takes place in plants and yeast. And the end products of all of this, for aerobic respiration, it produces oxygen and water as waste products, and then 38 ATP molecules. Whereas for anaerobic respiration, it produces lactic acid and 2 ATP molecules. And in plants, it produces alcohol, CO2, and heat. Okay, so make sure you understand this table because it summarizes a lot of the information that you need to know for respiration. Okay, so I'm quickly going to go through one experiment that we're doing this year. So normally we would do a couple of experiments, but this year we're only doing the one. And we are going to test whether, so right now we discussed and we said that during respiration, or at least during aerobic respiration, we produce CO2 as a waste product. So to test whether that is in fact true, we can do a bit of an experiment. So the experiment we're going to do is going to test whether carbon dioxide is released during respiration. So the aim of this experiment is to prove that carbon dioxide is released during respiration. Okay, and you can go look at this activity in the book. In fact, that's your homework. But we're going to discuss it here, so first watch the video. Okay, so this diagram, I'm going to refer back to this diagram, but we're going to have two test tubes. Test tube A and test tube B. Test tube A is going to be the experimental test tube, so that's the one that we are going to make a change to see if it changes, and then test tube B is going to be the control, so that's the one that we're going to use as a reference to refer it to. Okay, so in every experiment you need an experimental setup and a control setup. The control setup shows you the difference between the things that you are testing. So in this case, we want to test whether carbon dioxide is produced. So in the method, we're going to explain how this works, how they are different. Okay, so the method that we are using is we're using germinating beans, so just living beans. And we then set up two test tubes, as I showed you in the diagram. And at the bottom of the test tubes, we put in a little bit of clear lime water. Okay, now lime water is an indicator that we use to test for CO2. So we did a similar experiment in grade 8. So clear lime water can be used to test for CO2. Don't get confused by the term lime. Okay, that does not refer to the color or anything. So yeah, don't get confused. The lime water is only clear or white, but we'll discuss that now. Okay, so you set up the 2 test tubes with clear lime water in the bottom, and then you put something on top of the lime water to separate the beans from the lime water. Okay, so in this case we use a foam rubber. And then we take 30 beans and we split them into 2 halves, so 15 each, and we take 15 of those beans and we just put them in test tube A and seal it with a rubber stopper. Okay, so just rinse it and bleach to sterilize it, just so that there isn't anything else affecting the experiment. Sorry, I skipped that. Okay, so we rinse to sterilize the beans, but then we just take 15 of those beans and put them in test tube A. But then, very important, we take the other 15 beans and we boil them in water for 15 minutes. And this is going to kill the beans. Okay, and this is so that we can see the difference between when you have living beans, which will be hopefully respirating or making energy through respiration, compared to dead beans, which won't be using energy, so won't be making energy through respiration. So that is our control. So our control in this case are 15 dead beans that we killed by boiling them. And we place them in test tube B and also seal it with a rubber stopper. We then leave both test tubes in a warm place overnight. So the reason that you leave it overnight is because you don't want photosynthesis to interfere with the experiment. So if it's overnight and it's dark, there won't be any photosynthesis, so it won't interfere with the CO2 being produced. Okay, and then you leave it overnight, you come back, and then you examine the color of the lime water and you record the results. So let's see what the results would look like. Okay, so the results from this investigation, if you come back the next morning, you would expect to find, or you would find, that in test tube A, the lime water turned milky white. And we know that clear lime water turns milky white in the presence of CO2. So this means there was CO2 in test tube A. In test tube B, the lime water will stay clear. Okay, and that means there was no CO2. Okay, so what conclusion can we draw from this? Well, if there was CO2 in test tube A with the living beans, and there was no CO2 in test tube B with the dead beans, then it means that respiration took place in test tube A, but not test tube B, and in test tube A, it produced carbon dioxide. In test tube B, it did not produce any carbon dioxide. So the conclusion we can draw from this is that carbon dioxide is released during respiration. Okay, so whenever you write a conclusion, remember to go back to the aim or to the question that was asked. Okay, and the question that was asked, or the aim of this investigation, was to prove whether carbon dioxide is released during respiration. Okay, so once we've done the experiment and we have our results, then we can use that information to answer the conclusion, and that is that carbon dioxide is released during respiration. Okay, so use this experiment to answer the questions in the activity that you have to do for homework. I think it's activity 5, can't remember the page number, just have a look. Okay, but it's basically the same experiment, just instead of beans, it uses animals. Okay, but it is basically the exact same thing, because we just said that respiration takes place in plants and in animals. Okay, so this slide is actually not in your notes. Actually forgot to include it in your notes. But don't worry, I will make a copy of this and print it out on a small page and give it to everyone to just add to your notes. Okay, so don't worry about writing this down now. You can if you want, but you don't have to. Okay, so we are looking at where respiration is used in industrial processes. So there's actually a lot of industries that use the respiration power of organisms to help them make their goods. So the 3 that we're going to look at is beer, wine, and to bake bread. Okay, or any kind of baking really. So beer. To make beer, you start with some sort of grain. Okay, so something like barley, wheat, or even rye. Grains are things that you use to make bread. So you start with any type of grain, and you then mash it up, and they boil it, and they break it down basically, and then they add some yeast to it. And if you remember from anaerobic respiration in yeast, yeast is going to make energy through alcoholic fermentation. Okay, and we call that, or we oftentimes just refer to that as being fermented. So when these grains are being fermented by the yeast, that is going to, we call that alcoholic fermentation, which means it's going to produce alcohol. So that means it's going to produce ethanol and CO2 and heat. Okay, so these are the two that you want for beer. Okay, so it's going to make some ethanol and CO2, and that is going to make the bubbly beer that they can then sell. Okay, so you don't really need to know too much about it. Just know that grains are used to make beer through alcoholic fermentation, or by being fermented. Okay, then the second type of alcohol is wine, and in this case you just replace the grains with fruits. So fruits like grapes are used to also be fermented. Okay, so it also undergoes alcoholic fermentation, and it turns sugar into alcohol. Okay, so similar process to the beer, you just use different ingredients, and it's a bit of a different process, but the end result is the same. Okay, it produces alcohol. Then to bake bread, you would, if you've ever had to bake bread or ever baked bread with your family, then you would know that you add some yeast to the flour, and also a bit of sugar. So the sugar is going to act as food for the yeast, and the yeast is then going to undergo respiration and produce CO2, and that CO2 will then cause the bread to rise, which then makes the bread fluffy. Otherwise you would have rock hard solid bread, which wouldn't be nice. Okay, so by adding yeast to it and some sugar, it produces CO2, which creates these air pockets in the bread and makes it rise. Okay, so these are the three processes that, if they ask you for an example of respiration in industries, these are the three examples you can mention and just very briefly explain, like it is explained here. Okay, you don't need to be able to explain much more than this. Okay, and that's it for respiration. Sorry the video is quite long. I tend to explain too much, but hopefully it helps you. And this would have been 2 or 3 lessons in class, and we did it now in under 50 minutes. So hopefully it is helpful, and hopefully you can come back to it when you have to study this for your tests and exams. Okay, good luck, and see you guys next week.